Yeah, I don't have any. I don't think I can crank this. Can I crank this up? I'll just talk like this. Is that loud enough? Okay. I'm C.C. Warm. I'm the director of the Humanities Center, and it's my job to introduce the introducer, which I'm terribly inept at, so bear with me, and I'll just get through this as fast as I can. But I do have a few announcements, a few people to thank, and that is the following. Since the far distant reaches of memory, which for me goes back to about 2010, the Humanities Center has been giving a series of lectures, 4 lectures every year. And this year we get a bonus lecture, and I'm very happy about that, the story of which I'll go into in 1 second. But in order to make these things happen, there are a lot of people who do make that happen. There are a lot of people who work up in the Dean's Suite, which is right up here. I always point up here like it's heaven, but it's just up there, physically in this building. Dean Hill, Associate Dean Mitchell, both of whom are here tonight. Thank you very much. Dwight and Dennis, who do a lot of organizing for this building and keeping it functioning and keeping us organized. There's Kathy and Linda in the office, and there's Amanda, who does the great posters and flyers. Maybe that's why you're here tonight. Thank you to all of you guys. Thank you to Danny, my GA, who is here somewhere, who helps me in all sorts of ways right back there. Thank you. And there are other people to thank, but that's fine for now. As you can see, we do have 4 lectures usually. We already had Isabel Hall, who did a great lecture on the First World War, 100 years thereof, and international law. Back in September, we had Alice Begg, the punk Chicana, who came and did a talk about the early punk movement and her role in that as a Chicana growing up in East LA. We have next semester, as you'll see in your programs, we got programs, Jeannie Ludlow is our faculty speaker in January. She'll be doing a talk on undue burdens and personal responsibility. I hope you'll be present for that on Wednesday, January 21st. And Barbara King, the ethnobiologist, will be here to do a talk on how animals grieve, our keynote speaker in late March, just after the spring break. So please be cognizant of those events coming up next semester. This is the 5th talk, and the reason that we have a 5th talk is because the class, the Humanities Introduction to the Humanities course this semester is being co-taught by Dr. Gary Fitz from Biology and Dr. Charlotte Pence from the English department. I'm very happy that we have a class that's seeing the sciences and the humanities working together and talking about the interdisciplinary aspects of that. Maybe I'll let Charlotte, who will be coming up in a second, tell you a bit more about what they've been doing in their class. But as the new director, as the still very green new director, one of the things I really wanted to do was bring the sciences and the humanities into greater conversation. I think tonight's event is a perfect example of that kind of work. That is to say, one of the things that, the last person that I had to thank is the person that I want to thank the most for this, which is Charlotte, Charlotte Pence, who's coming up here in a second to introduce our guest speaker. She's done the work in getting the Redden Grant, and I need to thank, of course, Jack and Margaret Redden for their fund, which helps augment undergraduate teaching. She wrote the grant to get the money, the funds, to make this possible, and did all the vast majority of the legwork and organization and getting this to be a possibility. So why don't you thank her, and I will join you as she comes up to introduce our speaker for tonight.
All right, I don't have Charles's booming voice. Can you guys hear me okay there in the back? Yes? No? Diva says no. Diva. Okay, I'll
repeat everything after you say it.
I'll try that. I'll do my own voice. Well, first, thank you all for coming here tonight. It's always a pleasure to see people interested in what you are interested in. So this semester, I'm co-teaching a class with Dr. Gary Fritz from Biological Sciences. Co-teaching itself is not that common among academics, but what's more unusual is our particular pairing. I'm a poet in the English department, and Dr. Fritz teaches biological evolution and studies insects. One might say our only similarity is that we study two things that make others squirm, poetry and bugs. We decided to join forces and teach a class for the Humanities Center called Biological Evolution in the Humanities. Evolution, though, is such a huge, overstuffed word. Within evolution, there are many different branches, such as biological, which looks at how life has changed over time in response to environmental modifications. There's cosmic evolution, which studies how the cosmos has changed, and chemical, how life first came from the combination of molecules. Too often, though, evolution is reduced to this one idea of people descending from apes. And it is this one idea that gets the most airplay within the media, who create pro wrestling-like contests for survival between scientists and religious leaders. But what many public debates omit is how Darwin's theories enable our work today in areas like genetics, AIDS research, and antibiotic resistance. In the late 19th century, Charles Darwin proposed a theory of biological evolution that offered a new paradigm regarding the history of life on Earth and therefore our place in it. The seemingly radical theory, though, stood on the shoulders of many predecessors, including both contributions from the humanities and natural sciences. Today, the theory of evolution is arguably one of the most well-supported, robust theories in science and has transformed the way we perceive and understand ourselves and the diversity of life forms that surround us. While science and literature is one of my thematic interests, Joseph Carroll has made it his life's work to analyze science and literature. In versus and. This difference in seemingly minor words is huge. There's that Mark Twain quote that the difference between the right word and almost right word is like the difference between the lightning bug and lightning. Joseph Carroll, a true interdisciplinary scholar of literature, had the foresight to ask how science and literature could cooperate. What might be gained if we read with the Darwinian eye? And what would that mean? Or to approach this question from the other end, one could ask, if Darwin's theories have fundamentally changed the field of biology, how might Darwin's theories apply to literary scholars? Carroll's book, Evolution and Literary Theory, published in 1995, was the first book-length work in the field of evolutionary literary study. His 2004 collection of essays, Literary Darwinism, gave the field the name by which it is most commonly known, a field which has continued to attract preeminent scientists like E.O. Wilson and prominent authors like Ian McEwan. As Dr. Carroll has explained, quote, literary Darwinists are animated by a conviction that the human species has evolved in adaptive relation to a physical world, that human bodies and brains contain complex adaptive structures, and that the products of the literary imagination are shaped by biologically grounded motives, passions, and forms of cognition. Carroll's more recent publications include a second collection of essays called Reading Human Nature, and a collaborative empirical study graphing Jane Austen, The Evolutionary Basis of Literary Meaning. He has produced an edition of Darwin's On the Origin of Species and is co-editor of Evolution, Literature, and Film, a reader. Currently, he's a professor of English at University of Missouri in St. Louis, and we are very fortunate to have him here with us tonight. Please give a warm welcome.
Hi. I was talking earlier today to Charlotte's class and was telling them that they had just finished a book called Storytelling Animal by John Gottschall, who's one of my collaborators. And the book is about how human beings, uniquely in the animal kingdom, need stories, need imagination, need religious images, need art, need songs, not just for entertainment, not for fun, but actively need it in order to keep themselves sane, to orient themselves towards the right kind of behavior. It's part of their adaptive functional repertoire. So what I'm going to be talking about tonight is what I think is the final phase in a process of the unification of knowledge that has been going on now for centuries. I'm going to start actually in the early 19th century with the formation of a paradigm in geology, and then move into biology, and then the social sciences, and then finally the humanities. But we can also take it further back with the beginning of the scientific revolution and the Renaissance. The first phase of science was to understand the movement of the celestial bodies, the heavenly bodies, to understand celestial mechanics. And as we have progressed in knowledge, we've come ever closer to the peculiarities of human experience. And E.O. Wilson is one of the primary figures in the modern movement towards the unification of the sciences. He published this book in 1998, Consilience, The Unity of Knowledge. And when a couple of colleagues and I put together this anthology, Evolution, Literature, and Film, we went back and read everything that had been written in the evolutionary approach to the arts and the humanities over the past 20 years or so. And one of the things we saw when we reread it all was that after 1998, virtually everybody was referring to this book by Wilson. It was a rallying point. It sounded a clarion call for the ultimate unification of all knowledge, all the way from physics and chemistry through the social sciences and into the humanities. And that's the underlying or overarching sense of things that has guided the effort to use biology to talk about the sciences. The people who contributed to this movement don't think of it as just another wrinkle or just another angle or another possible aspect or another approach to their subject. They think of it as the final phase in a process that's been going on now for centuries, to bring all of knowledge together as an interlocked series of causal explanations for phenomena in the world. The basic principle is pretty simple. Physics, the principles that govern physics and astronomy contain and constrain and limit the principles that are at work in chemistry. Chemistry, the chemical elements are born from the activity of stars. And chemistry itself forms the basis for all life on Earth. Every living thing, there's a set of chemical compounds. And it moves directly into biology through molecular biology and genetics. And all of evolutionary biology is constrained by the principles that regulate the physical world outside of living things. And then the evolutionary social sciences, anthropology and psychology, are limited, constrained, directed, and informed by the basic ideas in evolutionary biology. And then finally, the humanities, at the bottom of this sequence of constraining principles, causal forces, are now making use of the ideas derived from the evolutionary social sciences and from evolutionary biology. Now, when I present this to literary scholars, they're sometimes unhappy with the idea that the humanities are on the receiving end of a whole series of ideas that limit the possibilities of knowledge. But you can flip around that hierarchy, which is a hierarchy of causal reduction, and say that there's another hierarchy of organizational complexity. And the principles of physics have emergent properties that appear only when we start talking about chemical compounds. There are levels of complexity in chemistry that can't simply be predicted from the laws of physics. And that's true also of molecular biology, that as soon as you get into living things, there are essential principles in molecular biology that can't be found in chemistry by itself. When you move to evolutionary biology, you have the whole history of evolution on Earth, the adaptive relation of organisms to changing environments. And again, that requires levels of complexity, of organizational complexity that are different from and can't be limited to those in molecular biology. And then finally, when you move up through the evolutionary social sciences to human behavior and get to the humanities, when you're dealing with novels and operas and symphonies and paintings and movies, you're dealing with what is arguably the highest level of organizational complexity in the world. It's often said that the human brain is the single most complex phenomenon in the world. So causal reduction is an effort to take complex phenomena like the humanities or like human behavior or like evolutionary biology and to reduce them to simpler principles. And at the same time, you can flip that over and look for the unifying links all the way up from the simplest laws and the simplest causal forces up to the most complex phenomena. So within the range of all the sciences, there is a specific relationship in which biology, evolutionary biology, is the crucial linking principle. You can talk about physics and chemistry and use it to discuss literary works, but it's not nearly as relevant, as close as the kind of principles that emerge from evolutionary biology. In evolutionary biology, because it influences the social sciences, finally gets down to a level of human behavior that is directly relevant to what goes on in literature. So what I'm going to talk about tonight is a set of 4 paradigms that have emerged in the course of the past 2 centuries. Each one is the necessary predecessor of the next. Evolutionary biology couldn't be established as the science until geology had finally understood the history of the earth, the way the rivers and mountains and plains and glaciers have formed over time, and until geology had created the sense of deep time in which evolutionary processes can take place. And until evolutionary biology was established as a science, it wasn't possible to talk about the evolved and adaptive character of the human mind. So it wasn't possible to talk about the evolutionary social sciences. And until the evolutionary social sciences were up and running and well developed, any effort to talk about the humanities in terms of biology were necessarily loose, vague, and speculative. So there's a kind of necessary sequence in the development of these paradigm formations. The argument here is that the evolutionary humanities are the last stage, the last frontier, the final range of information and knowledge that can be brought within this sequence of paradigm formations. There's a simple timeline that we'll run through in the course of this talk. Geology went through a period of philosophical speculation, people trying to understand how fossils could possibly have been created, and coming up with fairly wild speculative theories like the idea that all the continents were precipitated by Noah's flood, or that they all emerged in one great vast volcanic upheaval. Geology was finally settled, developed as a coherent, progressive, cumulative research program with adequate general causal principles only in 1833. In biology, the basic ideas in evolutionary biology were formulated only in 1859. Then there was a long period through most of the first 3/4 of the 20th century in which the social sciences and the humanities operated in complete separation from the ideas in evolutionary biology. This bracketed SSSM, that's the standard social science model, which is the term that's typically used to talk about the model of the social sciences that emerged in the first decades of the 20th century with writers like Boas and Durkheim in the late 19th century. It's the idea that culture is autonomous and that human behavior, human thought, human feeling is purely a result of the organizational complexities of culture, and that biology has nothing to do with any of it. That changed about 35 or 40 years ago, started changing. I used 1975 as a convenient reference point. That was the year in which E.O. Wilson published Sociobiology, the New Synthesis, an effort to discuss the evolution of social behavior in all animals and to include human beings in that sequence. So we're going to run through these 4 paradigm formations pretty quickly. Geology, this is Charles Lyell. He was older than Darwin, a generation older, became a close friend and a mentor for Darwin. When Darwin set out on the voyage of the Beagle, a 5-year trip around the world that was a formative educational influence for him as a young man shortly after he graduated from Cambridge, he took with him the first volume of Lyell's Principles of Geology, and the other volumes arrived while he was on the voyage. And much of his work, as he coasted up and down the coast of South America in the Beagle, which was doing surveying work, Darwin would get off and go tramping and naturalizing all over South America. And much of his work was done in looking at the geology. In fact, his first major published work was on the formation of coral reefs, a geological work. And it was through Lyell's work that he developed the idea of gradual massive changes taking place over almost unimaginable eons of time. Minute changes, the forces operating around us that we see at the present time. Erosion, precipitation, glaciers, volcanoes. The only major, really huge idea that Lyell didn't have yet in hand was the idea of tectonic plates, the idea of the gradual movement, shifting of the continental plates, which came out in the middle of the 20th century. But you can still call the Principles of Geology a paradigm because it provided a sufficient basic framework that could include the discovery of tectonic plates without altering its basic assumptions about the kinds of processes that were necessary to explain geological change. So Darwin, after he came back from the voyage of the Beagle, spent about 20 years. He, fairly soon after he got back, had the idea of the adaptation by means of natural selection, but he spent about 20 years building his case for it gradually. He wrote it out as the length of an article, secret, and wrote it out as a short book manuscript, and put the book under the stairs in a box with a note to his wife saying, if I die before I have an opportunity to publish this book, I want you to take £500 out of my estate and get it published. But finally he did. 1859 came out with The Origin of Species, which had so much success that he was motivated to extend it a little over a decade later with an explicit effort to include human beings in his account of how all species had developed over time. This is a couple of books about the history of social thought in the 20th century. Both of these books are about the standard social science model, about how late in the 19th century, a lot of people were trying to use Darwinian thinking to talk about human history and human behavior. And then there was a massive revolutionary or counter-revolutionary movement that eliminated biology for about 3/4 of a century. Pinker's The Blank Slate is the modern denial of human nature. gives a heavily documented case explaining exactly what people said and why they said it. And In Search of Human Nature, Carl Degler gives a history of that whole period. So the evolutionary social sciences began to emerge only within the last quarter of the 20th century. One of the first books here that can be clearly linked to sociobiology is 1968, Yanomamo by Napoleon Chagnon. Most of the early work in sociobiology focuses hard on the way behavior is regulated by reproductive logic. And the Yanomamo is a tribe of people who had not had much contact with the West, called the Fierce People. That's the subtitle. And it's a tribe of warriors in which reproductive success is directly linked to the number of people that you kill. This has been a major text in anthropology for many years. He went and lived with these people and learned their language and counted their babies. John Bowlby, attachment. Bowlby was a Freudian psychoanalyst who dealt with children who had lost their parents or had been separated traumatically from their parents in some fashion. And he integrated the idea of child development with the idea of the necessity for a child to attach to a mother. He's the founding figure in the modern theory of child development and influence that emphasizes the necessity for a secure bond between an offspring and its mother. The sociobiology I mentioned is E.O. Wilson's book, putting human beings simply with other species as just another species that has developed the power of interacting socially. The Evolution of Human Sexuality, Donald Simons, was the first book to take the principles of differential parental investment, the different costs that males and females incur in raising children, and apply it to human psychology. He's the founding father for the modern psychology of differences in mate selection motives by men and women. Homicide by Daly and Wilson. They just did a study of the number of children killed by parents and discovered that children with a resident male who is a non-biological parent are many times more likely to be murdered than children living with their biological parent. And then, so that again is sociology, sociobiology. It's drawing a direct link between reproductive logic and human behavior. Human Universals by Donald Brown. Brown looked at all the kinds of behavior that appear in every known culture. Marriage, coming of age rituals, sexual division of labor, ceremonies of every kind, color coding systems, language activities, and argued that if a behavior appears in every known culture, it must have a biological basis. It isn't simply produced by the peculiarities of that culture. And then evolutionary psychology as a specific school was founded roughly in 1992 with the Adaptive Mind, major landmark work, which took a militant stance towards the standard social science model and asserted vigorously that all psychology has to be understood in terms of evolved and adapted human characteristics. And then The Origin of Mind, 2005, David Geary summarizes everything that's known about the specifically human intellectual properties and integrates it with the earlier views on the adaptive mind. So finally, then we get to at the evolutionary humanities. I started working on it in the early 90s, and the first book that appeared is 1992, Ellen Dissanayakis' Homo Aestheticus, and My Evolution Literary Theory appeared in 1995. And it has increased dramatically in the pace over the past 20 years. A few of us, all of us who were starting it at first thought that we were working alone and only gradually discovered each other and finally started interacting and doing collaborative work. Here's just another set of the literary animal in the top left-hand corner. Turned out to be a landmark work. It put us on the map in a public way because it got a write-up in the New York Times Magazine. And it was a real lesson to us about the significance of the New York Times all of a sudden it was being reviewed everywhere, all over the world, and often with big chunks taken out of the original review, but not credited to the original review. So it was also a lesson in the, sort of the dissemination of information. John Gottschall's book, The Rape of Troy, in 2008, was perhaps the first really good, significant book that took anthropology and sociobiology and linked it convincingly with a literary work. It's about Homer's Iliad. It's about the whole background of a woman-raising culture like the Yanomamo that produced a literary work. And John succeeds in not just in recreating the anthropological background, but in making the imaginative worldview of Homer and the Greeks available. The Art Instinct in 2009, Dennis Dutton, that became an international bestseller. He's a philosopher of aesthetics, or was. He died in 2011. Brian Boyd's On the Origin of Stories, 2009, widely reviewed. And then Brian, John, and I put together Evolution, Literature, and Film, the anthology of 2010. So I want to make a distinction here between two different kinds of efforts to unify the humanities and the evolutionary social sciences. This is the first issue of an annual journal that I helped edit, the Evolutionary Review. The idea behind it was that we were going to get both literary scholars, people in the humanities, philosophers, and also scientists, biologists, psychologists, and anthropologists to write on general cultural issues, to write on their own topics, but also to speak to a wide general audience. So all of that is still in the manner of a general review. It's still in the manner of the humanities. It's discursive. A lot of the people had empirical training, but what they were presenting wasn't the results of empirical research. There are no statistics, no graphs. It's just general language commentary. There's that, and then there's this. This is an effort to bring the methods of the social sciences, statistical analysis especially, into the study of specific literary works. What we did with Graphic Jane Austen was to take a website questionnaire and put up a questionnaire on the web and listed about 2,000 characters from Victorian novels, and Dickens, George Eliot, Hardy, Jane Austen, and wrote to English professors and people interested in literature all over the world and asked them to go to the website and fill out a questionnaire on the characters. Just pick any character. As it turned out, Elizabeth Bennet from Pride and Prejudice was the single most popular character, naturally. 82 people filled out questionnaires on Elizabeth Bennet. And they answered questions about the character's motives and the character's personality and the criteria by which characters selected their marital partners. And they also gave answers to questions about their own emotional responses to the characters. And they said whether the characters were protagonists or antagonists. And we crunched the numbers on that with the intention of finding out what made a protagonist and what made an antagonist. Who are the good guys, who are the bad guys. We also set up a separate website for one novel, The Mayor of Casterbridge, just so that we could have a lot of data on one novel and see how far we could go into a close analysis of one novel. We ended up with 441 individual characters profiled and graphed, and we came to a conclusion. We actually looked at it and thought about it and came to a conclusion that we hadn't anticipated. One conclusion is that the moral disposition of the characters counts overwhelmingly more than the sex of the characters, that whether a character is a protagonist or an antagonist mirrors a basic political dynamic that's deeply embedded in human social organization. This book by Christopher Bone, Hierarchy in the Forest, is widely regarded, and rightly regarded, I think, as the most important book about the evolution of human sociality in the past 20 or 30 years. Bone spent he's in his 80s now, he spent half his career studying chimpanzees, social interaction, and half of it studying hunter-gatherer people and tribal people. And what he found out was that in chimpanzee societies, there's only one main principle of social organization, and it's status hierarchies, dominance hierarchies. All males dominate all females, all adults dominate all juveniles. The dominant alpha male dominates all the other males, and what you get for being dominant is more access to reproductive opportunities if you're male, and better food. And so just the bigger and the meaner you are, the more food and sex you get. And if you ask students sometimes to think about that and ask them how closely that corresponds to their own experience, they understand that. So what differs in humans is that in hunter-gatherer cultures, dominance is suppressed. Humans spent most of their evolutionary history as hunter-gatherers. It's only in the past 10,000 years that they settled down to be agriculturalists and then to be parts of industrial economies. So one of the governing assumptions in evolutionary anthropology and evolutionary psychology is that hunter-gatherer lifestyles reflect deeply embedded patterns in the human mind, that we've evolved to be hunters and gatherers, and we've only adapted somewhat imperfectly to more complex modern lifestyles. So what goes on in hunter-gatherer cultures matters for modern societies. And what goes on in hunter-gatherer cultures is egalitarianism. The subtitle of the book is The Evolution of Egalitarian Behavior. And bullying and assertions of dominance are not tolerated in hunter-gatherer cultures. Anybody who tries to bully his way through, to take somebody else's mate, to take more than his share of the food, is severely censured by the group. And censure can range all the way from just gossip and bad-mouthing to exclusion, expulsion from the group, which is basically a death sentence, or to outright execution. Bone, in a more recent book, On the Origins of Moral Order, did a study of the homicide rates and the reasons for homicide in hunter-gatherer cultures, and discovered that the majority of the people who are murdered, and the murder rates are much, much higher than in modern cultures, and the majority of the people who are murdered for getting too big for their britches. The hunter-gatherer culture won't tolerate dominance behavior. It requires cooperative behavior in a small, intensely interactive group of people, and dominance behavior is contrary to that. So what we found in the novel was a reflection of the kind of ethos that stigmatizes dominance behavior. The antagonists, the characters in the novels who are identified as antagonists, as bad guys, were also characterized as having an overwhelming desire for wealth, power, and prestige. That is for dominance. Whereas the protagonists, the people who are identified as the good characters, had characteristics that were heavily oriented towards prosociality, towards cooperation, towards self-effacing willingness to get along with other people. And what we concluded from that is that the novels create an artificial, imaginary world in which all the people who read it, at the time, all the people in England who are reading it, can feel that they're part of an interactive, cooperative community. It helps bind people, the novels as a whole, as a collective body, help bind people into a community. So to go back, we'll run through these 4 paradigms. The principles of geology was a necessary precondition for the emergence of evolutionary biology as a scientific paradigm. And evolutionary biology, Darwin's theory, was a necessary precondition for the emergence of the evolutionary social sciences, for evolutionary anthropology and evolutionary psychology. And the evolutionary social sciences were a precondition for the emergence of the evolutionary humanities only about 20 years ago. Now, the evolutionary social sciences, evolutionary psychology, is rapidly firming up, is developing, clarifying its basic principles, but it's still in process. Being an evolutionist in the humanities is trickier than it might be because we're not able simply to take the basic ideas from the evolutionary psychology and say, these are givens, these are axioms. We have to filter and assess and engage critically with the ideas from evolutionary psychology. It was only in the past 15 years or so that the evolutionary psychologists were able to take in the idea of a flexible general intelligence. Early evolutionary psychologists either emphasized the desire for reproductive success as a direct motive, exclusively limiting human behavior to that range of concern, or they talked about massive modularity. That is, they said that all human motives are encapsulated, regulated, mechanical. They left out general intelligence, one of the most important, specifically human cognitive adaptations, what makes it possible to behave flexibly and to create a modern world. They also put too little emphasis on the evolution of specifically pro-social cooperative behavior in humans. That process, that changeover, is still up in the air. There's an ongoing debate between the proponents of inclusive fitness, who believe that helping kin and reciprocal benefits are the only 2 motives that are really important in human social evolution. Between those people and the people who are arguing for group selection, as it's called, that is, selection for groups behaving pro-socially. It's still up in the air, but we've passed the watershed. We've past the tipping point. Where most of the more recent work that's been coming out has had a real understanding of human social evolution, of pro-sociality. We're still struggling to add in culture and imagination. I go regularly to the Human Behavior and Evolution Society conferences, and I know from direct observation that many of the people who study the evolutionary basis of human behavior have a hard time understanding what music and painting and literature and the other arts, what kind of advantage, adaptive advantage that could have for human beings. So that whole issue is still up in the air. The adaptive function of the arts and humanities. My own argument is that they, as I've already said, is that the arts are necessary to humans because humans have an imagination. They can't not live in their imagination. They can't help but see the whole world as an image, as a narrative, as a story that as a mythic structure that contains them and their friends and the past and the future. Whether it's a religious narrative or a political or ideological narrative, they must have some kind of imaginative structure that regulates their behavior. So one of the main ideas that is probably going to be the central line of development in thinking about the evolution of human behavior over the next 20 or 30 years is something called gene culture coevolution. It's the idea that culture has been a product of the developed human intelligence, and the developed human intelligence reacts on the actual genetic basis of the human mind. This book from 2009, The 10,000-Year Explosion, is the most advanced look at that yet. If you think about it, another book I could mention, Richard Wrangham's Catching Fire, How Cooking Made Us Human, is a study in gene culture coevolution. Wrangham talks about how developing the technology of fire made it possible to cook food, which reduced the amount of effort needed to digest food, which reduced the size of the human digestive tract. Humans have a much smaller digestive tract than any other species of comparable physical size, and freed up energy to go to the brain. So that one technology, developed in fire, radically altered the whole anatomical and physiological structure of the human genome. And it brought people together around the campfire. So it made the living together cooperatively, hunting and gathering, and living together cooperatively, crucially important. Humans, in the course of their evolution over the past million years or so, have gradually, dramatically increased the length of childhood and have therefore increased the period in which human offspring are dependent on their parents, and have, as a result, produced an adaptive response of pair bonding and dual parenting. So you've got two parents who are raising a child in a group that contains multiple adult males. Humans are the only species that combine those two things: cooperative effort among adult males and pair bonding between males and females. So you've got people sitting together around the campfire, and their whole ecology, their way of acquiring food and processing it, is dramatically altering their motivational structure, their gender characteristics, their sex characteristics, even in gross physical terms. In the course of human evolution, the size difference between males and females has steadily decreased, and that goes along with pair bonding. The more a single male is able to dominate multiple females and have them as his own, the larger the sex difference in the species. I'm sure you've all seen these naturalist programs with elephant seals. And the elephant seal, there's one big one that has about 300 females under his harem. And he spends his whole life either having sex with them or fighting off the 299 elephant seal males who want to occupy his position. So the female elephant seal is, moderately sized, and the male elephant seal is enormous. So the human species has changed dramatically in its actual anatomical characteristics in response to the social organization that was generated by its ecology and by the gradual transformation in the way it processes food. So that's gene culture coevolution. Another main anatomical change that has occurred over the past 500,000 years is the gradual diminution, the narrowing in the thickness of the skull, indicating that one of the things that was being selected for as males were occupying positions around the campfire and interacting cooperatively, one of the things that was selected for was peaceableness. The thick skull is very handy if the next guy you run into is likely to pick up a rock and smack you in the head with it. So the thinning in the skull indicates that the necessity for defense has diminished over time. In the 10,000-Year Explosion, Cochrane and Harpending give a lot of other evidence for what they call the self-domestication of the human species. The human species, as it came together in towns, agriculture made dense, larger populations possible. That happened only about 10,000 years ago. But in the past 10,000 years, the whole human organization has put a strong selective pressure on people who are able to interact in a relatively civil and cooperative way with large numbers of other people. So restraint has been selected for, even in very recent times. So I think gene culture coevolution is the clearest basis for working out from hardcore evolutionary anthropology to evolutionary social science and linking it with culture, with the kind of imaginative productions that accompany every human society. So here are just examples of imaginative culture. I'm going to run just quickly through three versions of the adaptive mind. This is the earliest version, the narrow school evolutionary psychology, emphasized just a few basic instincts: survival, growing up, interacting socially, mating, parenting, and kinship. And it really had almost nothing to say about the arts and humanities. This book by Pinker, How the Mind Works, has an argument, a famous argument, that the humanities and the arts are basically just side effects. They're non-adaptive, non-functional side effects of cognitive powers that evolved to solve practical problems. And he likens the arts and the humanities to rich foods like cheesecake that are rich in fat and sugar, which would have been adaptive. We developed taste buds that make us appreciate fat and sugar because they were calorie rich in an environment in which calories were always scarce, in which being hungry was a common fact of life. And nowadays, of course, we have access to all kinds of food that isn't good for us. So his argument is that it's like that kind of food, or it's like addictive drugs, that that it's a pleasure technology, that we use movies or songs or stories to push our pleasure buttons in the same way that we drink alcohol or inject ourselves with heroin or cocaine or amphetamines, just to give us a thrill. And he also likens it, if we're not to autoeroticism. It's a way that people can just give themselves pleasure with no adaptive function. So early evolutionary psychology is a crucially important phase in the development of the discipline because it does identify the basic motives that are part of all human social groups, but it really has an inadequate grasp of culture. And the second phase, I call it broad school evolutionary psychology. It assimilates and accepts all of those basic motives that the narrow school identifies, but it adds in general intelligence and thus enables itself to explain the sciences and the arts and technology and the extensive trade organizations and economies. And then finally, you've got the humanist evolutionary psychology, which accepts both narrow school and broad school psychology, but includes religion and art and music and stories and myths and ideology as part of the whole necessary adaptive complex for the specifically human mind. So you can look at it like a matryoshka doll, one of these little Russian dolls with dolls inside dolls. The innermost core of the human nature is basic motives: hunger, thirst, fear, lust, love of parents for their children and children for their parents, the desire for social interaction. And then add in at a second layer general intelligence. As that brain expanded, what it mainly expanded was the frontal cortex, this part right up here. That's where advanced flexible planning comes into play. And over the past million years or so, that's the part of the brain that's been developing most. And then finally, the humanist side of the layer of the human mind takes in the imagination, stories and myths. So what does this have to do with art and literature, which is my main subject? Well, my argument is that literature and the arts are about human nature. And we can organize human nature by looking at the basic pattern of the human life cycle. Mating, giving birth, forming families, and growing old and dying. So if you look at that, take that as your basis for talking about art and literature, then you have to say how specific cultures like the Egyptians or the Persians or the Maoris or New Yorkers, how they organize the basic patterns of human motives. And then you have to look at how individual artists like Shakespeare or Frida Kahlo, how they take their individual temperaments, their personalities, their personal experience, their individual passions, all the things that have happened to them, how they shape how they take basic human motives filtered through their particular culture and shape it in an individual way to create particular works of art. So to get from human nature to the study of individual works of art, you have to go through at least 2 more layers. You have to talk about how an individual culture organizes all the elements of human nature into a coherent system, and how individual artists take that material from an individual culture and organize it into particular works of art. So we've come this far. It's been very recent. The evolutionary humanities are only a couple of decades old. If you look at the history of modern science, goes back to the 1500s. Our understanding of geology and biology. Geology is only a couple of hundred years old, and biology is even less than that. The evolutionary social sciences are still in development and have only been developing for less than half a century. And we've only got a couple of decades on the evolutionary understanding of the arts and the humanities. I think that there is a certain kind of inevitability to the ultimate acceptance of an evolutionary framework for understanding all human behavior. There's a certain axiomatic logic. Humans have evolved. They have complex adapted structures, physiological, anatomical, neurological, hormonal, neurochemical. Those are, you can't pick up the newspaper on any given day without finding new information about genetics or neurochemistry. So we're learning fast about the way humans are deeply embedded in their evolutionary nature. And once you open that door and understood it, there's really no going back. You can't say that, oh, well, we were just kidding. We'll ignore all of that and talk about human motives and human feelings and human values and human ideas without reference to what goes on in the brain. Check back in 20 or 30 years, and I think almost no one will step outside the range in which the structure of the brain is a constraining force on anything that can legitimately be said about human behavior. And once that's in place, and you understand that the arts and literature are generated, that their passions are generated by basic human motives, and that they're part of the adaptive functional structure, there's not really any point in talking about the arts and the humanities without trying to make as strong a link as you can to the overarching causal explanatory framework. It's possible to always talk merely descriptively, to talk about. I just finished listening to a book on the history of coal. Coal is the basic material that was transformative in the Industrial Revolution. It was the fuel source that powered the steam engine and created the iron world. And it's possible to talk about something like that without ever having direct and explicit appeal to evolved and adapted human emotions. But it's not possible anymore to talk about it in ways that directly contradict the basic assumptions that the brain and the body interact in an intimate way with the environment. And in fact, this book on coal it's written by an environmental lawyer who has concentrated hard on the serious debilitating effects that the toxic fumes from coal have on the development of children. So the development of children's brains and bodies. So I think that at a certain point, probably within the lifetime of most people sitting here in this audience, it'll no longer be the case that we speak specifically of evolutionary anthropology or evolutionary psychology, because all psychology and all anthropology will be necessarily evolutionary. It'll simply be taken for granted. And the only alternative for the humanities then is either to accept that and to try to work within that parameter, or to declare that the humanities, the human mind and imagination, are somehow completely isolated from all the causal forces at work in the world and from the rest of the world of knowledge. And that position would not be a happy position for the humanities. As many of you probably know, the humanities have, over the past 20 or 30 years, been steadily losing prestige and funding. The many volumes with titles like The Crisis in the Humanities that run through those statistics. And the humanities won't regain a position of honor and prestige in the world of knowledge by standing apart from the rest of the world of knowledge and trying to operate in explanatory ways that are directly in contradiction to what most people actually see all around them every day. So I'm fairly optimistic. Over time, I think that there's an inevitable development. And in any case, there's already a vast world of opportunity available to the people who take up this field. It's like settling Illinois 150 years ago, when there was just this open land ready for exploitation and development.